Hello, my dear adventurers. It's Fox. Welcome back to another evening of shared stories and adventures. Many of you have wandered with me through the quaint village of Elderwood before. But tonight, the change of the seasons brings with it a whole new chapter in our story. Autumn is upon us, and with it, the spiced breeze and the promise of harvest festivals that light up the village like 1,000 tiny stars. So we're stepping back into the cozy confines of the Hearth and Herb, our beloved apothecary shop nestled in the heart of Elderwood. Amongst the rows of fantastical herbs and bubbling cauldrons, the magic of the season comes alive, and every corner of this little store holds a tale waiting to be told. Whether it's the simple joy of preparing remedies for our neighbors or the thrill of a late-night mystery, there's always something brewing in the apothecary. We'll be seeing familiar faces, of course, like the ever-curious Thistle, always with a nose for trouble, and our favorite former apprentice Elsie, now a fully fledged apothecary in her own right. We'll meet a couple of new villagers as well and see what kind of adventures everyone gets up to. So whether you're a lover of folklore with a taste for mischief, a herbalist with a steady hand and a keen eye, or simply someone who enjoys the cozy comfort of a well-told tale, it's time to settle in. Let the crackling fire warm your bones and lose yourself in the magic of the Elderwood Apothecary. Story 1. Autumn at the Apothecary. The village of Elderwood was a place where the rhythm of life moved with the seasons, each turn of the calendar bringing a new flavor to the air. As the days grew shorter and the leaves turned to shades of copper and gold, the village buzzed with the preparations for autumn. It was a time of harvest festivals, hearty stews, and the warm glow of fires in every hearth. At the heart of Elderwood stood the Hearth and Herb, an apothecary shop that had become the soul of the village. It was a quaint little place, with a weathered wooden sign hanging above the door, etched with an image of a cauldron surrounded by herbs. The windows were fogged with the steam from simmering concoctions inside, and an intoxicating melting pot of scents greeted any who crossed its threshold. Elsie, one of the apothecaries, was perched on a sturdy oak stool, carefully hanging a garland of dried Elwyn oranges and tiny enchanted pine cones above the shop's entrance. The decorations swayed gently as she worked, adding to the cozy ambience that the villagers had come to expect. Cedric, her former mentor and new partner in all things apothecary, was busy at the counter, arranging bundles of autumn herbs, violet mugwort, elderberry, and sage, into neat bouquets tied with rustic twine. The shop was a riot of colors and textures. Shelves crammed with jars of dried roots, vials of vibrant potions, and baskets overflowing with seasonal ingredients. A warm, inviting light snuck through the windows, bathing everyone and everything in a soft golden cloak. On the floor was Thistle, the plump orange cat who had claimed the apothecary as her kingdom. She was busily engaged in her own version of decorating, batting at a strand of dried pixie rope hanging low from a shelf, her round body wobbling comically as she pounced, only to land with a soft thud on the wooden floor. Elsie paused to chuckle, her voice filled with affection. "Thistle, if you knock that over, you'll be the one cleaning it up," she teased, though the warmth in her tone suggested she'd do it herself as always. Thistle purred in response, clearly undeterred by the mock scolding, and returned to her play, her clever eyes gleaming with mischief. The morning breeze passed by lazily, bringing with it the first customer of the day. The familiar sound of the bell above the door announced the arrival of Mr. Puddlewick, the village cobbler. Wrapped snugly in a thick scarf, he shuffled in with a slight cough, his weathered face crinkling into a smile as he spotted Elsie and Cedric. "Good morning," he greeted, his voice tinged with a nasally rasp. He pulled a handkerchief from his coat pocket and dabbed at his nose. "It's that time of year again. I think this change in the weather's got me coming down with something. How's about a little remedy for a cold?" Elsie nodded with a smile, climbing down from the stool. "Of course, Mr. Puddlewick. You've come to the right place. Let's get you something to ward off that chill before it gets any worse." She reached for a jar of dried elderflowers, their pale yellow petals still fragrant from the summer sun. As she measured out the correct amount into a mortar, Mr. Puddlewick perused the shelves, his eyes landing on a basket of throat lozenges wrapped in wax paper. "These will do nicely," he said, taking a few and tucking them into his coat pocket. "Can't have a scratchy throat when there's so much work to be done." Cedric joined them at the counter, expertly grinding the elderflowers with a few other herbs before adding them to a small glass vial filled with honey and warm water. He sealed it with a cork and handed it to Mr. Puddlewick. "This tonic should help ease your symptoms," Cedric said reassuringly. "Take it in the evening, and you'll be back on your feet in no time." Mr. Puddlewick took the package gratefully, a hint of relief already in his eyes. "Thank you, both of you. Stay warm yourselves. I'll see you at the Harvest Festival, I'm sure." As he left, the bell tinkled again, signaling the arrival of the next customer. The door opened to reveal the village blacksmith, a burly man with a thick head of hair and soot-streaked hands being wiped on a leather apron. He was followed closely by his young son, who clutched at his father's side, his eyes wide with curiosity. "Morning, Cedric, Elsie." The blacksmith greeted them with a smile that showed the deep lines of a man accustomed to hard work. "I'm going to need another jar of frostbane salve. This chill in the air is making my hands stiff as old iron, and I can't afford that with the work I've got piling up." Cedric nodded, already moving toward the shelf where they kept the salve for just such needs. "It's a good thing you came by, Bert. The mornings will only get colder, and it's best to stay ahead of it." While Cedric wrapped the jar of salve in brown paper, the blacksmith's son wandered over to a new display near the counter. His eyes grew as round as saucers when he saw the mystic menagerie cards, their edges shimmering faintly with a touch of magic. Among them, a card featuring a dragon whelp caught his attention. The little dragon on the card puffed out a tiny stream of smoke as it moved, and the boy's face lit up with excitement. He tugged at his father's apron, practically bouncing on his toes. "Can I get this one? Please?" Bert turned to see what had captured his son's attention, his expression a mix of amusement and exasperation. "You know you're supposed to be learning the craft, not filling your head with card games," he said, though his tone was softened by the fondness in his eyes. With a sigh, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a few coins, handing them to Cedric. Cedric grinned as he handed the card to the boy, who accepted it as though it were a treasure. The boy stared at the card in awe, clearly enthralled by the small dragon's animated antics. Bert ruffled his son's hair with a chuckle. "Just don't let it take your mind off your lessons. All right?" The boy nodded eagerly, already lost in the world of his new card. As they left, the blacksmith cast a grateful glance back at Elsie and Cedric. "Thanks for the salve. I'll see you at the festival." The door had barely closed behind them when it opened again, this time to reveal Clara, the village baker. She walked in with an air of purpose, her eyes sparkling with the excitement of the season. "Good morrow, friends," she called out, brushing a stray lock of hair from her face. "As you've no doubt heard, I'm planning to hold a little autumn festival this weekend, and I'll be baking my famous Ambervale spiced pumpkin pies. But I need a few ingredients I'm running low on. Amber crystals to crush atop the pies and sunfire essence for that warm kick it gives them. Do you have any in stock?" Elsie frowned slightly, glancing over at the shelves. "I'm afraid we're full out of amber crystals, and we'll need honeyed cinnamon bark to make more sunfire essence. Cedric, would you mind heading to the general goods store to pick up the bark?" Cedric nodded, already reaching for his coat. "I'll head over right now and be back before you know it." As Cedric left, Elsie smiled at Clara. "Don't worry, we'll have everything ready in time for your pies. I'll go collect more amber crystals myself, and we'll make sure you have everything you need." "Thank you, Elsie," Clara said, her expression filled with gratitude. "I'll save you a slice of the first pie that comes out of the oven." Elsie chuckled. "I'll hold you to that." With Thistle trotting along beside her, Elsie closed shop and stepped out into the crisp autumn air. The village of Elderwood was a picture of seasonal beauty. cobbled streets lined with trees shedding their golden leaves, and houses with smoke curling lazily from their chimneys. Elsie breathed in deeply, feeling a sense of soft happiness settle over her. There was something special about this time of year, when the world seemed to slow down just enough to appreciate the simple joys of life. And with the promise of Clara's delicious pies and the warmth of the hearth and herb, she knew this autumn would be as cozy and magical as ever. But first she had to find those amber crystals, and the only place to get those was from the nearby cave in the Fay Glade. The path to the Fay Glade wound its way through the heart of Elderwood, meandering past the village square where the harvest festival would soon take place. Elsie walked with a purpose, Thistle trotting along by her side, occasionally passing by casually between Elsie's legs. Her thoughts drifted to her little quest at hand. Clara's Ambervale spiced pumpkin pies were legendary in the village, rich and flavorful with a buttery crust, and a filling that combined the sweetness of Ambervale pumpkins with the warmth of sunfire essence and a hefty serving of caramelized amber crystals for some crunch. The thought of them made Elsie's mouth water, and she was willing to brave the Fay Glade for them, even if it was a little eerie sometimes. The village gradually gave way to the dense forest that bordered Elderwood, the trees growing taller and the underbrush thicker, but Elsie knew the way by heart. She had been visiting the forest for years, ever since she had first joined the apothecary as an apprentice, often gathering herbs and roots from the woods. The Fay Glade was a place of magic, hidden deep within the forest, where the veil between worlds was thin. Long ago there'd been a hermit living here in a small, now abandoned shack. He disappeared one day, nobody knew where, though the talk of the taverns for many nights after the event had been of how he must have found his way to the other world. Elsie shook the thoughts out of her head, laughing nervously at herself. As she and Thistle entered the glade, the atmosphere shifted. The light filtering through the trees took on a soft, ethereal quality, and a faint arcane energy buzzed in the air around them. The trees here were older, their trunks thicker and more twisted, almost comically so. Thistle's ears perked up as they entered the glade, and she began to trot ahead, her movements more intentional now. Elsie watched her with a smile, knowing that Thistle always seemed to sense the presence of the Fae before she did. The amber crystals Elsie sought could only be found in a small cave nestled at the far end of the glade. The crystals formed naturally over time, the result of sap from ancient trees that had hardened and become infused with the magic of the glade. The entrance to the cave was just as she remembered, hidden behind a thick curtain of ivy that clung stubbornly to the rocky outcrop. Elsie pushed the ivy aside and ducked into the cave, the temperature dropping slightly as the daylight dimmed. From her satchel, she pulled out and lit a small lantern, its muted glow illuminating the rough stone walls and the damp earth beneath her boots. The cave was a tad narrow at first, forcing her to move carefully as she toed the uneven ground. But soon it opened up into a larger chamber, where the amber crystals shimmered faintly, protruding delicately from the cavern wall. Their surfaces were smooth and warm to the touch. Elsie set the lantern down and gently began to break off some crystals, tucking them securely into her satchel. She hummed an old folk tune as she worked, and Thistle explored gracefully, stopping periodically to sniff at a patch of earth. But she soon grew bored, and something deeper within caught her attention. Without a sound, she darted off into the shadows, her orange fur disappearing behind a corner into the darkness before Elsie could react. Thistle! Elsie's voice echoed off the stone walls, the sound unnervingly loud in the stillness of the cave. There was no response, just the distant drip of water and the faint rustle of something moving further inside. A chill crept up her spine, and she hesitated, the light from her lantern flickering as if in response to her unease. She called again, her voice softer this time. The only answer was a faint, tinkling sound, like the chime of tiny bells. Elsie's heart skipped a beat. She knew that sound, it was the fairies. Gods, please, I don't want to disappear like the hermit, she said, to herself mostly, before picking up the lantern and following the direction she'd seen Thistle run in. The passage narrowed again, forcing her to squeeze through a gap in the rock, and she had to duck to avoid hitting her head on a low-hanging stalactite. The path widened into a small space, clearly not made for a human, as she still had to bend slightly to avoid the ceiling. Soft blue-cap mushrooms illuminated the area, and sparkling mana motes danced in the air, carrying the light to and fro. And there, in the center of the chamber, was Thistle, curled up on a bed of moss, purring contentedly as a group of tiny fairies tended to her. One fairy was scratching her behind the ear, while another offered her a treat, a tiny berry that pulsed with flavor. Elsie stood hunched in the doorway, relief and some exasperation washing over her. Thistle, of course, had managed to find the fairies and was now being pampered like a queen. The cat opened one eye and blinked lazily at Elsie, as if to say, "What took you so long, you little troublemaker?" Elsie muttered, though she couldn't help the fond smile that tugged at her lips. The fairies looked up as she approached, their bright eyes curious and watchful. They were no larger than a thumb, with delicate wings that shimmered like stained glass. They didn't seem alarmed by the human's presence, continuing to pet Thistle and offer her treats. Elsie knelt down, gently scooping the cat into her arms. "You can't just run off like that," she chided softly, though there was no real anger in her voice. Thistle purred, clearly unbothered by the scolding, and nuzzled into Elsie's chest. The fairies watched with interest, and Elsie knew better than to leave without offering something in return for their kindness. Reaching into her pouch, she pulled out a small piece of honeycomb she had brought with her, a favorite treat of the Fae. She placed it on the bed of moss where Thistle had been lying, and the fairies immediately fluttered down to inspect it, their tiny hands reaching out to touch the golden honey. "Thank you for taking care of Thistle," Elsie said quietly, giving the fairies a small nod of respect. They chirped in response, their laughter filling the chamber as they enjoyed their treat. With her cat cradled in her arms and the amber crystals in her pack, Elsie made her way to the cave entrance and began her trek back to the apothecary. Meanwhile, Cedric was making his way through the busy streets of Elderwood, heading toward the general goods store to pick up the honeyed cinnamon bark he'd need to make the sunfire essence for Clara's pies. The village was buzzing with the usual midday activities. The chatter of neighbors traveled from one open window to another, and the clatter of carts being wheeled across the cobblestones set a rumbling rhythm. Autumn had arrived in full, and with it, the excitement of the upcoming harvest festival. Finnick, the village jester, was entertaining some of the locals with some of his classic card tricks. He twirled and spun, danced and flourished, all to hide the subtle sleight of hand he manipulated the deck with. Cedric grinned, tossing a gold coin his way. Finnick caught it smoothly, tipping his hat in thanks and bowing low. He crossed the main market square, watching as artisans set up their stalls, preparing to showcase their craftsmanship and goods in the festival. Everyone was in high spirits, and it was infectiously gratifying. Soon enough, he found his way to old Samuel Briarthorn's shop. The door creaked on its hinges as he pushed it open, the sound blending into the steady hum of the village outside. The general goods store was a cozy little place, crammed full of everything the villagers might need, from sacks of flour and jars of preserves to tools and household items. The floor was stacked and lined with crates of all sorts, fresh fruits, earthy vegetables, and even the more exotic produce from further off lands. Cedric's personal favorite were the chimera grapes, a fascinating variety of grapes that changed flavor from one bite to the next, from sweet to sour then spicy. As Cedric stepped inside, the bell above the door tinkled, and Samuel Briarthorn, the store's proprietor, looked up from behind the counter, a warm smile spreading across his wrinkled face. "Cedric, good to see you, lad," Samuel called out, his voice carrying the kind of cheer that only came from decades of serving the same familiar faces. "What can I do for you today?" "I'm here for some honeyed cinnamon bark," Cedric replied, returning the smile. "Clara's got big plans for her pies, and she's counting on us to help make them special." "Ah, yes, the pies." Samuel's eyes twinkled with enthusiasm. "Got a fresh batch of bark in just the other day." Let me fetch it for you." As he busied himself in the back, Cedric allowed his gaze to wander once more, his eyes catching on a display near the counter that he hadn't noticed before. It was a small stand, cluttered with oddities that seemed to have been collected over the years. Wooden figurines carved into the shapes of fantastical creatures. A leather-bound book with a clasp that looked suspiciously like a dragon's claw, and a small jar of what appeared to be moon dust. It was the kind of place that made you feel like you could spend hours just browsing through all the little treasures tucked away in every corner. Just as Cedric was reaching out to pick up one of the wooden figures, the door to the shop swung open with a clatter, and in swept Mrs. Haddle, the village's self-appointed gossip, librarian, and matchmaker. She was a round, jolly woman, with sharp eyes that missed nothing and a tongue that could both flatter and flay, depending on her mood. An ever-present blush sat on her cheeks, and her skirts danced with every step and turn. Mrs. Haddle exclaimed with joy when she saw him, her voice carrying across the room with ease. "Fancy seeing you here. Just the person I needed to speak to." Cedric barely had time to straighten up before she was upon him, her plump hands patting his arm in that familiar, motherly way she had. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Haddle," he managed, though he already knew what was coming next. "Oh, it's not just afternoon, dear boy. It's the perfect time to discuss your future," she trilled, her eyes gleaming with enthusiasm. "It's high time you settled down, don't you think? A fine young man like yourself, all alone in that apothecary. Why, it's practically a crime." Cedric forced a smile, trying to inject a bit of humor into his voice. "The shop keeps me plenty busy, Mrs. Haddle. I'm not sure I could handle anything more." "Nonsense," she replied, waving his words away as if they were no more substantial than the dust motes floating in the air. "You need a wife, Cedric. Someone with a good head on her shoulders. Someone who can keep you on your toes. And I know just the girl." "Mrs. Haddle, please," Cedric interjected, holding up a hand in mock surrender. "I'm perfectly content with my life as it is." She gave him a look that clearly said she wasn't convinced. But before she could press the issue further, Samuel reappeared with a small burlap sack in hand. "Here's that honeyed cinnamon bark, Cedric," he said, handing it over with a knowing smile. "Sounds like Mrs. Haddle's trying to marry you off again." "Eh? Trying being the key word," Cedric replied jokingly. Mrs. Haddle huffed, though there was no real annoyance in her expression. "I'm just looking out for him, that's all. Someone has to make sure he doesn't waste away in that apothecary of his." Cedric chuckled as he handed over a few coins to Samuel. "Well, I appreciate the concern, but I think I'll be just fine. Besides, Clara's pies will keep my spirits up for a good while." At the mention of the pies, Mrs. Haddle's eyes lit up. "Oh, those pies! Make sure you save me a slice, won't you, Cedric? I'll be counting on it. I'll do my best," he promised, knowing full well that the pies would disappear the moment they were set out at the festival. With a final wave, Mrs. Haddle turned to begin her own shopping, and Cedric gathered up the sack of honeyed cinnamon bark. He slipped out of the shop, the faint sound of Mrs. Haddle humming to herself fading into the background. As he made his way back to the hearth and herb, Cedric couldn't help but laugh to himself. Mrs. Haddle meant well, even if her matchmaking attempts were more than a little overbearing. And truth be told, there was a certain comfort in knowing that the village was filled with people who cared, no matter how much they meddled. For now, though, it was time to get back to the apothecary. Sunfire essence wouldn't make itself, after all. Back at the hearth and herb, Elsie was just returning from the Fay glade, Thistle nestled comfortably in her arms. The cat's eyes were half closed in contentment after her little adventure. The pouch of amber crystals hung from Elsie's belt, the warm glow barely visible in the fading light of the early evening. The apothecary's door creaked slightly as she pushed it open, the familiar sense of herbs, potions, and dried flowers welcoming her home. Cedric arrived not long after, entering with the sack of honeyed cinnamon bark. The fire from the hearth lit the room, its gentle yellow embers draping warmth over the rows of jars and bundles of herbs that lined the shelves. Elsie was at the counter, laying out the amber crystals she had collected, her expression focused as she carefully inspected each one. Cedric placed the sack of bark on the counter with a soft thud, causing Thistle to lift her head slightly before curling back into a tight ball on her favorite cushion near the window. "You found them then," Cedric said, nodding toward the crystals. "After a bit of a chase, yes," Elsie replied with a wry smile, glancing over at Thistle. "Our little troublemaker decided to go on an adventure with the fairies. Took me deeper into that cave than I'd planned, but we got what we needed." Cedric chuckled softly, shaking his head as he pulled up a stool beside her. He began to untie the sack, and the sweet, spicy scent of the honeyed cinnamon bark filled the air as he opened it. "And I've got what we need for the sunfire essence. Clara will have her pies in no time." Elsie nodded, her fingers gently tracing the smooth surface of one of the amber crystals. "These turned out well. They've got a good warmth to them." She set the crystal aside and reached for a mortar and pestle. "I'll crush these up while you prepare the essence." Cedric got to work, his hands moving with deft ease as he measured out the honeyed cinnamon bark and the other ingredients for the sunfire essence. He worked methodically, the process one he had performed countless times before, but still with the same care and precision as always. The small cauldron on the stove began to bubble gently, the mixture inside turning a rich, caramel color as it simmered. Meanwhile, Elsie ground the amber crystals into a fine powder, musty notes of warm earth and resin rising from the mortar as she worked. The soft scraping of the pestle against the stone filled the room with a soothing noise, mixing with the quiet bubbling of the cauldron. Thistle, now fully awake, stretched languidly before jumping onto the counter, her curious eyes watching as Cedric stirred the cauldron. He paused for a moment to scratch the cat behind the ears. "You're not getting into this one, Thistle," he murmured, though there was no real threat in his voice. Elsie laughed softly, glancing over at them. "She's probably wondering what we're making that she can't have. Though knowing her, she'll find a way to get a taste if we're not careful." Elsie finished grinding the last of the amber crystals. She carefully poured the powder into a small pouch, tying it securely with a bit of twine before setting it aside. While Cedric poured the sunfire essence into a glass vial, the liquid inside shimmering with a smoky heat as he stoppered it with a cork. He handed the vial to Elsie, who tucked it into the same pouch with the amber powder. The apothecary was quiet now, the work just about done. Outside, the evening was settling in. The village bathed in the soft light of the setting sun, as the villagers began to close up shop and head home. As they finished up, Clara arrived, her cheeks flushed from the cool evening air, and streaks of dough staining her hands and clothes. She called out as she entered, her voice full of cheer. "I can smell that sunfire essence from outside. Is it ready?" "It is," Elsie replied, handing over the pouch of amber crystals and the vial of sunfire essence. "Everything you need for your pies." Clara accepted the items with a grateful smile, her eyes shining as she carefully inspected them. "These are perfect. Thank you both ever so much." "We're just glad we could help," Cedric said warmly. "Remember your promise to save us a slice." Clara laughed, tucking the pouch and vial into her basket. "I'll save you more than that. I'll make sure you each get your own pie. You deserve it after all this work." With a final wave, Clara left, the door closing behind her with a soft click. The apothecary was quiet once more, and the sense of satisfaction that came with a job well done settled over Elsie and Cedric. They shared a glance, a silent acknowledgement of the day's efforts, before Cedric let out a soft sigh, leaning back against the counter. Another day, another adventure, and all in the name of pies. Elsie chuckled softly, reaching over to give Thistle a little belly rub. As the last of the evening light faded from the windows, Elsie extinguished the lanterns one by one, the apothecary slowly descending into the soft darkness of night. The day was done, and with the promise of the harvest festival on the horizon, The village of Elderwood was ready to embrace the warmth and joy that autumn always brought. Story 2: The Echo Stone. The morning sun seeped gently through the gauzy curtains, pulsing a soft glow that seemed to wrap the world in a tender embrace. The village of Elderwood, nestled within the protective arms of ancient oaks, stirred to life with a quiet kind of anticipation. A place where time itself seemed to stretch and yawn in the golden light of dawn. In a small cottage on the village's edge, Elsie lay half awake, her senses slowly tuning into the world around her. She opened her eyes, revealing irises as green as the first shoots of spring, and blinked at the ceiling beams, tracing the familiar patterns in the wood grain. Her hair, a cascade of fiery red, was tousled from sleep, strands sticking out here and there like unruly wisps of flame. A sprinkle of freckles, a legacy of long-forgotten summers, peppered her nose and cheeks. She looked around her home, cozy and humble, but it was everything to her. There was her favorite armchair, positioned perfectly to catch the morning sun, and beside it, a stack of books she'd been meaning to read. On a small wooden shelf near the window, a collection of trinkets was displayed, each one a keepsake from her adventures. There was a smooth stone she'd found on the shores of Moonvale Lake, a tiny silver bell given to her by a traveling merchant, and a worn leather-bound journal where she recorded her thoughts and dreams. The kitchen was simple, with a small wooden table and chair, and a stove that had seen many a magical meal. The window above the sink overlooked the forest, and beyond that, the rolling hills that surrounded the village. Elsie sat up, stretching her arms above her head, and her gaze drifted to the hearth, where a small fire crackled quietly. On the rug before it, her cat Thistle was curled up in a tight ball. She was a purring bundle of orange fur, with eyes as sharp and yellow as a flickering flame. "Good morning, Thistle," Elsie murmured, her voice still hushed with the remnants of sleep. Thistle's ears twitched at the sound, and she uncurled slowly, blinking up at Elsie with a lazy gaze that held both affection and expectation. Elsie swung her legs over the side of the bed and padded to the kitchen, her feet finding the familiar coolness of the stone floor. Her movements were unhurried, each step a beloved ritual, as she began to prepare breakfast, not just for herself, but for Thistle as well. She fetched a small dish and carefully placed a fresh piece of tuna in it. From one of the many jars on the shelf, she took a pinch of foxflower seed powder, a rare ingredient that she had foraged herself from the deepest parts of the forest. With a practiced hand, she sprinkled the powder over the tuna, watching as it shimmered briefly before settling. "There you go," she said, placing the dish on the floor. Thistle approached with regal grace, sniffing delicately before tucking in, her little paws kneading the wooden floor in delight as she ate. Elsie smiled, a warmth blossoming in her chest, and turned her attention to her own breakfast. A simple affair of bread, honeyed butter, and a steaming cup of herbal tea. It was one of those perfect, tranquil moments that made her love living on the edge of the village. But soon enough, the day would begin, and there was work to be done. With the meal finished, Elsie donned her coat. The deep green wool was soft and worn, familiar against her shoulders. She gathered her things, sliding small vials and pouches into the pockets of her satchel, each item finding its place with ease. Thistle, now sated, followed her to the door, her yellow eyes bright with curiosity. Together, they stepped outside into the crisp morning air, the world beyond the threshold alive with the subtle sounds of a village awakening. The cobblestone path that wound from her cottage to the heart of Elderwood was lined with wildflowers, delicate petals trembling in the gentle breeze. Elsie walked slowly, drinking in the tranquility of the morning, while Thistle trotted beside her, occasionally darting off to chase a drifting leaf. As they passed through the village, Elsie exchanged quiet greetings with the townsfolk, her heart swelling with a sense of belonging. Mrs. Haddle, the village librarian and matchmaker, was already tending to her garden, her hands deftly snipping the amber roses that grew in abundance around her home. The scent of the blooms, rich and heady, danced in the air around them, overpowering the earthy aroma of the soil. "Good morning, Elsie," Mrs. Haddle called, her voice warm and tinged with the lilt of years well lived. She straightened, wiping her hands on her apron before plucking a particularly lovely rose from the bush. "For you, dear. A bit of sunshine for your hair." Elsie accepted the rose with a smile, tucking it behind her ear where it nestled against her fiery curls. "Thank you, Mrs. Haddle. That potion I made for you? How are you feeling?" "Never better," Mrs. Haddle replied, her eyes crinkling with a smile that held the secrets of 1,000 matchmaking schemes. "You've got a gift, Elsie, truly." As they continued on their way, a young boy came sprinting down the path, his cheeks flushed with excitement. It was the blacksmith's son, and he skidded to a halt when he saw Thistle, his eyes lighting up with delight. Thistle loved being the center of attention and allowed herself to be petted, her purring louder than usual as the boy ran his fingers through her fur. The boy giggled as the cat rubbed against his hand, and after a few moments, he reluctantly pulled away. "We're going fishing at the lake today," he announced, as if it were the most important news in the world. "I gotta go now, or they'll leave without me." He dashed off to rejoin his friends, who were already calling him from the edge of the village, their fishing rods slung over their shoulders. Soon enough, the hearth and herb apothecary came into view, the shop's wooden sign swaying gently in the breeze. It was a place of comfort, of healing, where the villagers knew they could find not just remedies, but a listening ear and a kind word. Elsie unlocked the door and stepped inside, the familiar smell of dried herbs and burning wood enveloping her. She set to work immediately, her hands moving with the confidence and precision that came from years of practice. After lighting the hearth, she took inventory, noting down what needed to be restocked. Greater mana potions, Talador orchids, and invisibility elixirs. Those would be her top priorities for the next supply run. Villagers drifted in and out, each one a story, a need, a puzzle to be solved. It was a steady, comforting routine, and Elsie relished the sense of purpose it gave her. At one point, Cedric emerged from the back room, his presence as familiar as the ticking of the clock on the wall. He was more of a friend now than a mentor, but his wisdom and experience were still invaluable. With his tousled brown hair and thick beard, he looked every bit the wise apothecary. But his twinkling smile and the way he spoke of his adventures always made Elsie feel like there was still so much to learn. "Morning, Elsie," he greeted, a broad smile spreading across his face. He crossed the room in a few long strides, his hand reaching out to ruffle Thistle's fur. "Ready for another day of saving the world, one potion at a time?" Elsie laughed, filling the room with the warmth of the sound. "Always, Cedric. Always." Cedric leaned against the counter, launching into one of his stories about a distant land he once visited. Meanwhile, Thistle played happily with a loose piece of string on the floor, occasionally pausing to bask in the warmth of the hearth. As the last customer left and the apothecary grew quiet, Elsie took a moment to breathe in the warm, herb-scented air. Thistle, now curled up in her favorite spot by the hearth, looked up at her with sleepy eyes. "Ready to go home?" Elsie asked softly. Thistle responded with a soft purr, and Elsie smiled, gathering her things once more. Together, they stepped out into the evening air. By the time they reached her cottage, the first stars were twinkling in the sky. Elsie pushed open the door, and Thistle darted inside, heading straight for her favorite spot by the hearth. As the evening wore on, Elsie settled into her familiar routines. She lit a few candles and prepared a mouth-watering dinner of moonberry glazed wyvern steak. Then she sat down at the small wooden table in the corner of the room, where her journal lay open, waiting for her to record the events of the day. Elsie wrote about the villagers she had seen, the remedies she had prepared, and the peaceful moments she had stolen for herself in between. It was a habit she had developed long ago, a way to reflect and find solace in the everyday rhythms of life. But as she wrote, a strange sense of unease began to creep into her thoughts. It was subtle at first, a fleeting feeling that something was off, but the more she tried to push it away, the stronger it became. She set down her quill, frowning as she tried to pinpoint the source of her discomfort. She glanced around the cottage, but everything was as it should be. The fire crackling softly, the gentle glow of twilight, Thistle's peaceful breathing. Yet the feeling persisted, a nagging worry that she couldn't quite shake. Finally, Elsie decided to put her thoughts aside and prepare for bed. Maybe a good night's sleep was all she needed. She tidied up the kitchen, making sure everything was in its place, then crossed the room to her bed, where she slipped under the covers with a sigh. Thistle jumped up to join her, curling into a warm ball at her feet. Eventually, exhaustion won out, and Elsie drifted off into a deep, dream-filled sleep. But the dreams that came to her were unlike any she had experienced before. In her dream, Elderwood was still the same village she knew, but everything felt subtly wrong. The colors were muted. The once vibrant greens and blues of the landscape now dulled to shades of gray. The whole atmosphere was heavy, thick with an unspoken sadness that draped over the village like a dark shroud. Elsie found herself walking through the village square, but it was empty, devoid of the usual bustle of villagers going about their day. The shops were closed, their windows dark, and the familiar laughter and chatter of the townsfolk were conspicuously absent. She continued on, her footsteps echoing eerily in the stillness. As she passed by the bakery, the warm, inviting smell of pastries was gone, replaced by a faint, acrid scent that made her nose wrinkle. The windows were clouded with dust, and the door hung slightly ajar, creaking on its hinges as it swayed in the cold breeze. Further down the road, she came to Mrs. Haddle's house. The once meticulously kept garden was overgrown. The vibrant amber roses now darkened to a deep, almost black hue. Thorns twisted around the bushes, their sharp points catching on Elsie's cloak as she passed. The house itself looked neglected. The paint was peeling, and the windows were boarded up. A sense of loss hung in the air, so thick it was almost tangible. Suddenly, she saw a figure in the distance, standing in the shadow of an alleyway. It was Finnick, the village jester, but he was not his usual cheerful self. Instead of juggling or telling jokes, he was slumped against the wall, his face hidden beneath the brim of his hat. He was turning a coin over and over in his fingers, humming a somber tune that sent a chill down Elsie's spine. "Finnick," she called out, but her voice seemed to fade into the heavy air, swallowed up by the oppressive silence. Finnick didn't respond, didn't even look up as she approached. The sight of him like this, so unlike the lively friend she knew, filled her with much dread. She wanted to reach out to him, to shake him out of this strange, melancholic state, but something held her back. It was as if an invisible barrier stood between them, keeping her from getting too close. The more she tried to push through it, the more it resisted, until she finally gave up, stepping back with a sinking feeling in her chest. The dream culminated at the edge of the village, where a large, ancient oak tree stood. Its gnarled branches reached out like skeletal fingers, and the ground beneath it was cracked and dry, as if all life had been drained from the earth. Elsie stood beneath the tree, feeling its mighty presence bearing down on her. Then she heard it, a soft, whispering voice, calling her name from somewhere within the shadows. It was faint, almost indistinguishable. Elsie! The sound of her name echoed in the still air, and she was jolted awake, her heart racing, and her breath coming in short gasps. Thistle, sensing her distress, meowed softly and nuzzled her hand. Elsie stroked the cat's fur absently, trying to shake off the lingering sense of shock. Her youthful intuition gave her the feeling that it was more than just a nightmare. It felt like a warning, or perhaps a glimpse into something she couldn't yet understand. Something was changing in Elderwood, and she needed to find out what it was before it was too late. The next day, the morning sun that streamed through the windows felt oddly distant, disconnected somehow. Elsie's usual morning routine, making tea, feeding Thistle, tidying up, felt oddly mechanical, like she was going through the motions without fully engaging. The dream had left her feeling out of sorts. As she slipped into her coat and gathered her things, Elsie couldn't help but glance out the window, half expecting to see the twisted version of Elderwood from her dream. But the village looked as it always did, quaint, welcoming, full of life. The sight brought a small measure of comfort, but it wasn't enough to dispel the gnawing worry that had taken root in her mind. "Come on, Thistle," Elsie called, her voice a bit more strained than usual. The walk to the apothecary was usually one of Elsie's favorite parts of the day. The cobblestone streets, the friendly faces of the villagers, the simple, everyday rhythms of life in Elderwood. It all brought a sense of peace and contentment. But today, everything felt off. Elsie frowned but kept walking, her pace quickening slightly. Once at the apothecary, she began busying herself with her daily tasks, hoping for the trickle of customers to take her mind off things. They began to arrive one by one, as they always did. But there was something different in their demeanor. They seemed more reserved, less lively, as if the cheerfulness that usually characterized Elderwood had been drained away. Elsie greeted each of them with a smile, but the responses she received were muted, distracted. It wasn't long before the first sign that something was truly wrong presented itself. Mr. Puddlewick, the village cobbler, who usually dropped by for a simple remedy for his aching joints, came into the shop. His usual jovial expression was replaced by a tight-lipped frown. He looked around the shop with a strange intensity, as if searching for something he wasn't sure he would find. "Morning, Mr. Puddlewick," Elsie said, trying to keep her tone light. "What can I help you with today?" He hesitated for a moment, his eyes flicking to the shelves before settling on her. I was wondering if you had any twilight jasmine," he asked, his voice low, almost furtive. Elsie blinked in surprise. Twilight jasmine was a rare herb, known for its use in darker, more dangerous potions, nothing that would typically be found in her shop. She shook her head slowly. "I'm afraid we don't stock that, Mr. Puddlewick. It's not something we usually carry." He looked disappointed but nodded, his shoulders slumping slightly. "I see. And what about a dark water potion? Do you have any of that?" Elsie's unease deepened. Dark water potions were even more dangerous, often used in curses or for ill intent. She forced a smile, trying to mask her concern. "No, I don't have that either. Is there something else you're looking for? Something more typical?" Mr. Puddlewick shook his head, a strange look in his eyes that Elsie couldn't quite read. "No, that's all. Thank you anyway." He turned to walk away out of the shop, his gaze drifting over the shelves once more. The rest of the morning passed in a similar fashion. More villagers came in, their requests growing increasingly strange and concerning. A young woman asked for shadowmoss, a deadly plant usually associated with poisons. An elderly man inquired about a potion to cause forgetfulness, his voice tinged with desperation. Each request left Elsie feeling more unsettled than the last. And through it all, Cedric was nowhere to be found. Normally, he would have been in and out of the shop, offering advice or sharing one of his stories. At the very least, he would normally pass by to give Thistle a little scratch under her chin. But today his absence was glaring. Elsie couldn't help but worry. Cedric was always reliable, always present. The fact that no one seemed to know where he was made the skin at the back of her neck prickle. She spent the next hour searching the apothecary from top to bottom, hoping to find some clue as to where he might be. Her search eventually led her to the attic, a place she rarely visited. The air was thick with dust, and the only light came from a small, grimy window near the ceiling. As she moved through the cluttered space, something caught her eye. A small, dusty journal that looked out of place among the other items stored there. Elsie picked it up, brushing off the dust to reveal the name Mirabelle, embossed on the cover in faded gold letters. Elsie hesitated for only a moment before opening the journal. The pages were yellowed with age, and the handwriting was elegant, almost delicate. As she began to read, she quickly realized that this wasn't just any old journal. It was the personal diary of a former apothecary who had once lived and worked in Elderwood. Mirabelle's entries detailed her life in the village, much like Elsie's own journal did. But there was something more, a sense of foreboding that grew with each page. Mirabelle wrote about strange occurrences, unsettling dreams, and a growing darkness that seemed to be taking hold of the village, much like what Elsie was experiencing now. One entry in particular caught her attention. The old apothecary described discovering an artifact called the Echo Stone, a powerful relic said to have the ability to reveal alternate timelines or parallel realities. According to the journal, the stone had been used long ago, during a time of great strife, to stabilize the region and protect it from warring kingdoms. But the stone's power was not without consequences, and it seemed that it had the potential to create rifts between realities if triggered by strong emotions or unresolved conflicts. Elsie's mind raced as she read on. Could this Echo Stone be responsible for the strange changes she was noticing in Elderwood? Could it explain the dark, twisted version of the village she had seen in her dream? And if so, what could she do about it? As she reached the end of the journal, she found a final cryptic entry. Mirabelle wrote of burying the Echo Stone beneath an ancient oak tree at the edge of the village, hoping that it would remain dormant and forgotten. Elsie closed the journal softly, resting her back against an old crate, her mind spinning. She spent the rest of the evening in the apothecary, feeling at a loss. She thought about the villagers, her friends, even dear Cedric. She had to find a way to restore their timeline, to banish the distorted echoes from their reality. Elsie stood up, dusting off her cloak and looking out of the small attic window. The moon was a gleaming, cold orb in the night sky, lending an almost gothic feel to the village. She steeled herself, the realization dawning that she was the only one who could save her home now. She'd set out at first light and spent the next few hours preparing. Various herbs, flowers, and potions were packed tightly into her satchel, along with a small mortar and pestle. She was no warrior, like the adventurers that sometimes passed through town, but her own abilities and skills made her formidable in her own right. With Mirabelle's journal tucked securely in her satchel and thistle padding beside her, Elsie stepped out into Elderwood, a village she knew by heart. Yet on this morning, it definitely felt different. Every corner she turned, every familiar sight seemed touched by an unseen hand, a distortion that twisted the ordinary into something subtly unsettling. The sun was out, but its warmth felt hollow, like a memory rather than the present. She first headed to the village square, where the market usually bustled with energy. But today, The vendors' stalls, though still standing, seemed to sag under the weight of invisible burdens. The colors were muted, the vibrant reds and yellows of fruits and fabrics now washed out, as though they were viewed through a thin layer of dust. The villagers, who usually greeted her with warm smiles and lively chatter, were quiet, their conversations reduced to murmurs, their eyes distant. Elsie's steps slowed as she approached the blacksmith's shop, a place that should have been filled with the rhythmic clang of hammer on metal. Instead, the shop front seemed tired, the once sturdy wooden door hanging slightly askew, creaking softly as it swayed in the sullen breeze. The sign above the door, which proudly bore the blacksmith's name, was now faded, the letters barely legible, as if the world itself was forgetting its identity. Inside, the forge was cold, infused with the smell of old smoke and rusting iron. Tools lay scattered haphazardly, where they had once been meticulously organized. And there, near the cold hearth, sat the blacksmith's son. The boy Elsie had seen just the day before, full of life, eager to join his friends by the lake. Now he was a picture of sorrow. His small frame hunched over a set of wooden figurines that he moved listlessly across the dusty floor. His once bright eyes were dull, staring at the toys without really seeing them. Elsie knelt beside him, her heart tightening at the sight. "What happened?" she asked gently. The boy didn't look up. "They're gone," he whispered, his voice choking back unshed tears. "My friends, they're gone." Elsie's breath caught in her throat. "Where did they go?" The boy shook his head, still not meeting her gaze. "I don't know. They were here and then they weren't. Just like that." As he spoke, a movement in the shadows drew Elsie's attention. From the corner of the room emerged a small, brilliant orange fox, its fur shimmering in the dim light. The fox trotted over to the boy, nuzzling his hand with a gentle insistence. The boy looked down at the animal, his lips twitching into a faint smile as he reached out to stroke its fur. "This is Ember," he said softly, his voice filled with a tenderness that hadn't been there moments before. "She's also my friend." Elsie watched as Thistle, who had been quietly observing from a distance, approached Ember cautiously. The two animals circled each other, their eyes locked in a silent exchange. For a moment, Elsie feared they might not get along. But then, as if coming to a mutual understanding, they nuzzled each other gently, their initial wariness replaced by an easy companionship. A realization dawned on Elsie as she watched them. Thistle and Ember. They were reflections of each other, counterparts from different realities. The markings on their fur were identical, and the way they moved in unison confirmed what Elsie had begun to suspect. Ember was the alternate reality version of Thistle. With a trembling hand, Elsie reached into her satchel and pulled out a small vial, an animal-speaking potion she had crafted for moments like these, when Thistle's mischievous behavior required more than just a stern look. She uncorked the vial and gulped it down, grimacing at the bitter taste before she turned to the fox. "Ember," she began, her voice steady despite the racing of her heart. "Can you tell me what's happening? Why are these two realities merging?" The fiery animal looked up at her with knowing eyes, and when she spoke, it was with a voice that carried the weight of both wisdom and sorrow. "In the other timeline, without you and the apothecary, Thistle was lost, transformed into a forest spirit trapped in this form. I am what she became in that world, where the balance was shattered." Elsie's breath hitched as she processed Ember's words. The weight of the revelation pressed down on her, making it hard to think clearly. "So, what do I need to do to fix this? To keep our realities from merging?" Ember's gaze softened as she nudged the boy, who had been silently listening to their conversation. "Restore the balance, Elsie. Prevent the emotions and regrets that gave the Echo Stone its power from consuming the village. Help the villagers find peace, or both worlds will be lost." Ember curled up beside the boy, who stroked her fur absently, while Elsie sat back on her heels, the gears in her head whirring. This was more than she had ever expected, more than she felt prepared to handle. But there was no turning back now. She stood up, bidding the boy and his little companion goodbye, and tilted her head fondly as Thistle nuzzled Ember one last time. Her next stop was the bakery, a place that had always been a cozy haven of warmth and comfort, with the sweet scents of honeyed berry rolls and arcane frosted apple tarts filling the air. But as she approached, the usual welcoming aroma was absent, replaced by a faint, burnt smell that made her heart sink. Inside, the bakery was dim, the windows clouded with flour dust. The once neatly arranged displays were now disheveled, with half-baked loaves of bread and misshapen pastries scattered across the counters. Behind the counter, Clara, the young baker, sat slumped on a stool, her hands covered in flour, her eyes red from tears. Elsie approached cautiously, her voice gentle as she called Clara's name. The baker looked up, and the despair in her eyes hit Elsie like a physical blow. "I can't do it," Clara whispered, her voice cracking with emotion. "Everything's gone wrong. I've tried so hard, but nothing works anymore." Elsie glanced around at the failed attempts littering the bakery. Loaves that hadn't risen, pastries that were burnt or undercooked, dough that had collapsed into a sticky mess. It was as if Clara's very spirit had been sapped, leaving her unable to create the magical treats she was known for. Kneeling beside Clara, Elsie reached into her satchel and pulled out a small pouch of select herbs. She crushed them with ample honey in a small mortar she carried, creating a draught of obsidian clarity, a potion meant to calm the mind and steady the nerves. Handing the potion to Clara, Elsie spoke softly, her words filled with the confidence she hoped to instill in the young baker. "I know you're struggling, Clara, but I've seen the wonders you can create, the dragonfire bagels, the starfall eclairs that everyone in the village loves. I've seen them, indulged in them far too many times really." Clara chuckled weakly as Elsie continued, "You have the talent, you have the skill. Don't let this darkness take that away from you." The young baker stared at the potion for a long moment before taking a tentative sip. The effect was almost immediate. A sigh escaped her lips, and some of the tension eased from her shoulders. She looked at Elsie, her expression that of gratitude and lingering doubt. "Do you really think I can do it?" Clara asked, her voice small but hopeful. Elsie smiled, squeezing Clara's hand reassuringly. "I know you can. You're the best baker in the entire region. Don't let a few bad days make you forget that." For the first time since Elsie had entered the bakery, Clara smiled. A small, tentative smile, but a smile nonetheless. As Clara began to clean up the mess and prepare for a new batch of dough, Elsie felt a surge of hope. One small victory, but it was a start. With a final encouraging word, she left the bakery and headed to find the location of the next distortion, to find someone else she could help. She remembered the state of disrepair Mrs. Hattle's home had been in and decided to go looking for her. Suspecting the darkness was at play, she made her way to the village library. The building, once a spire of knowledge and community, now loomed before her like a shadow of its former self. The tall, arched windows that had once let in warm, golden light were now dimmed, the glass clouded with dust. The vines that crawled up the stone walls were thick and wild, well on their way to forming an impenetrable barrier. Elsie pushed open the heavy wooden doors. They creaked with the effort, and she stepped inside cautiously. But absent from the air was the smell of old parchment and polished wood that Elsie loved so dearly. The shelves, once meticulously organized, now seemed to sag under the weight of neglected books, their spines cracked and pages yellowing. The fireplace, which had always been a source of heated comfort, was cold and empty, its hearth filled with ashes forgotten. The sense of regret was heavy here. The library had deteriorated far faster than Elsie could have ever expected in the span of just a couple of days. Mrs. Hattle sat at her usual place behind the large oak desk, but the lively, vibrant woman Elsie knew was gone. In her place was a reclusive, melancholy figure, her hair streaked with gray and her shoulders hunched with the burden of unspoken regrets. Her fingers trembled as she absent-mindedly traced the edges of an old, faded photograph on the desk. A photograph of a young couple, smiling at a future that never came to be. Thistle bounded ahead, leaping onto Mrs. Hattle's lap with a gentle purr. The sad woman looked down at the cat, a faint hint of a smile barely forming, tinged with much sorrow. "Thistle," Mrs. Hattle murmured, her voice soft and distant. "You always know when someone needs a bit of comfort, don't you?" Elsie approached slowly, her heart aching at the sight of the woman who had always been the heart of the village. The older woman sighed, her gaze drifting to the photograph on the desk. "Oh, Elsie, I've been lost in memories. Memories of what could have been, if only I had been braver. If only I had pursued the love I once had." Elsie's eyes followed Mrs. Hattle's to the photograph, the image of the young couple so full of hope and promise. "Who is he?" Elsie asked softly. Mrs. Hattle's eyes glazed over with a far-off look as she reached out to gently touch the photograph. "His name was Edmund. We were so in love. But life has a way of getting in the way of the things that matter most. We had dreams, plans, but I let fear and uncertainty keep me from following my heart. And now I don't even know where he is, or if he's still out there somewhere." Elsie's heart ached at the sadness in Mrs. Hattle's voice. She was somewhat of a romantic, hopelessly so, and she had always believed that it wasn't too late to rekindle the flame of love, no matter how much time had passed. "Mrs. Hattle," Elsie began, her voice filled with determination. "What if we tried to find him? What if we reached out to him, wherever he might be?" The woman looked at Elsie with hope and some measure of fear, her hands trembling as they clutched the photograph. "But how? I wouldn't even know where to begin." A thought sparked in the young apothecary's mind, and she reached into her satchel, pulling out a small velvet pouch. From it, she extracted a single flower, a destin bloom. It was a deep velvet, with soft yellow veins running through its petals, a rare and magical flower, rare to grow, rarer even to find. It was one of Elsie's most prized possessions. According to old herbalist legends, the destin bloom had the ability to always find its way to where it was needed most, to where the heart's truest desire lay. Elsie opened the desk drawer and retrieved a quill and a piece of parchment. She placed them on the desk in front of Mrs. Hattle and then pulled out her miniature mortar and pestle. Carefully, she began to crush the destin bloom's petals into a fine, ink-like paste, the scent of the flower filling the room with a sweet, pleasantly earthy aroma. Mrs. Hattle watched in silence as Elsie worked, and when the ink was ready, Elsie dipped the quill into the paste and handed it to her. "Now write to him, Mrs. Hattle. Let him know how you feel, and trust that this letter will find its way to him. With a deep breath, Mrs. Haddle began to write. Her hand was unsteady at first, but as the words flowed, her movements became more confident, more sure. She poured her heart onto the parchment, each stroke of the quill filled with the love and longing she had kept hidden for so many years. When she finished, she set the quill down and looked at the letter, her eyes glistening with tears. "Thank you, Elsie," she whispered, her voice filled with gratitude. "Thank you for giving me this chance." Elsie smiled warmly, placing a comforting hand on Mrs. Haddle's shoulder. "Give this to the courier tomorrow when he does his morning rounds. Trust me." Mrs. Haddle nodded, her heart lighter than it had been moments ago. She carefully folded the letter and placed it in an envelope, sealing it with a wax stamp. As she did, the faintest glow emanated from the Destinblum ink, a sign that the magic was already at work. Elsie waved her farewell and stepped out into the now faded light. Evening had arrived, and she knew it was time to confront the source. She picked Thistle up, tucking her snugly under her coat, and let her feet carry her to the very edge of Elderwood. The forest grew thick under the canopy of trees, and her footsteps sunk ever so slightly into the damp earth. After a short journey, the oak stood before her, its gnarled roots twisting and turning, like the regrets it had sought to bury. Under the spreading branches, she saw him, Cedric, her former mentor and friend, slumped against the broad trunk, his eyes closed as if in deep thought. A faint glow emanated from the echo stone, half buried in the ground beside him, pulsing like a gentle heartbeat. A faint, hazy light shimmered around it, growing brighter steadily. There wasn't much time left, Elsie thought to herself. She approached Cedric with measured steps. He stirred, his eyes fluttering open, and for a moment they were filled with a sadness so deep it seemed to reach beyond the confines of the present. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice rough and distant. "I didn't mean for it to come to this." Elsie knelt beside him, her hands resting on his. "What happened, Cedric?" He sighed, his gaze drifting toward the stone. "It's my fault. This village, the people, I failed them. And now, the past is seeping back through the cracks I've left." Cedric turned to face her fully, his voice tinged with the bitterness of old wounds. "Many years ago, before you became my apprentice, there was another. His name was Arlo, a brilliant young man, full of potential, but he was drawn to the darker aspects of magic. I tried to guide him, to steer him away from that path, but in the end, I failed. I had no choice but to banish him from the village." Elsie gave his hands a small squeeze, pouring all the conviction she had into the touch. "You did what had to be done. and you saved the village. I've seen what could have happened to these people if the darkness from Arlo's potions and crafts had been left to fester. The misery the villagers would face. Even poor Thistle wouldn't be here. You saved us all. But what if I could have done more? Cedric's voice cracked with the force of his doubt. If I'd been a better mentor, nurtured Arlo instead of banishing him? Elsie shook her head softly, smiling gently at him. You were the greatest mentor I could have asked for. If he didn't want to be saved, there's nothing else you could have done. Cedric's breath hitched, and for a moment, the stone's glow flickered. The weight of Elsie's words seemed to ease the tension in his shoulders, the lines of worry on his face softening. Slowly, the light of the echo stone dimmed, its power waning as the connection to Cedric's unresolved regrets weakened. The woods around them exhaled, and all the melancholy that had been draped over the village seemed to dissipate into the night air. Cedric sighed deeply, his hand reaching out to Thistle, who had been watching the scene with wide, curious eyes. The little cat nuzzled into his palm, her purrs a soft reassurance that all was well again. He stood up, brushing the dirt from his tunic, and turned homeward. Cedric and Elsie made their way back to Elderwood, the first blush of dawn rising from behind the trees. They walked past the lake, where the water rippled and danced lazily, and there at the edge was the boy from earlier. The sounds of his laughter pierced the calm morning air, and he swung his fishing rod into the lake, shouting gleefully with his friends by his side. Elsie beamed affectionately and gave him a friendly wave. The well-trodden streets looped into the village proper, and they walked past lively homes, joy and comfort radiating from behind every open window. Mrs. Haddle was snipping away at her garden, this time trimming at a hedge of full-grown starleaf blossoms. The village courier strolled past, and she called out to him eagerly, slipping a wax-sealed letter into his pack. Elsie even caught sight of Finnick, juggling in the village square, tipping his hat and clapping his feet at the end of every trick. And as soon as she passed by the bakery, her stomach growled loudly. "Rather hungry, aren't we?" joked Cedric, his gleeful laugh back in full force. Elsie grinned sheepishly and dragged him inside the bakery. Clara was behind the counter, a concentrated but entirely happy look on her face, kneading a fresh batch of dough. "2 dragonfire bagels, please, heavy on the lava cream cheese," winked Elsie, giving Clara a winning smile. Thistle meowed with annoyance, rubbing up against Elsie's leg as if to say, "Haven't you forgotten someone? Oh, and 1 small sardine swirl pastry for Thistle," she added. The trio left the bakery, goods in hand, and continued along to the hearth and herb apothecary. The loud rhythmic clanging from the blacksmith's forge was back, and Elsie couldn't be happier to hear the sound. Crossing the threshold, Elsie flung off her cloak and sunk into a chair by the fireplace, diving into her breakfast bagel. Cedric chuckled and swung the sign on the door before closing it behind him. Gone gathering, be back tomorrow, now proudly displayed outside of the shop. Elsie raised an eyebrow quizzically. I figured you deserve a break after saving the village and all, shrugged Cedric. He sat down on the rug nearby and fed Thistle her little treat, pausing only to catch up on all the chin scratches he'd missed over the last few days. And so the apothecary glowed under the day's bright light, joy spilling from every corner. Tomorrow, they'd be back to selling everyday remedies and garden herbs. But today, Elsie was happy to simply soak in the warmth and company of her dearest friends. A farewell for now. And so, friends, we come to the end of our autumnal tale in Elderwood. I hope our time in the apothecary, surrounded by the warmth of hearth fires and the scent of brewing potions, has brought you a sense of comfort and a touch of magic. As we close the door on this evening's story, remember that this village, with its golden leaves and whispering woods, will always be here, waiting for your return whenever you yearn for the coziness of familiar surroundings or the charm of simple, heartfelt moments. Take care, stay warm, and until next time, farewell.